Not everybody that makes it to the NBA is going to have a great career, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be forgotten. It is possible to be a bad NBA player, but still be a legend, still be memorable all these years later. So what are some of these guys up to now? First up, let's talk about the original sensation, Jeremy Lin. He went undrafted back in 2010, but in 2012, he had his moment. Linsanity is something that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if the world still exists and the NBA still exists, people are still going to remember this few-week stretch, now known as Linsanity, where Lin completely reinvigorated a Knicks team that wasn't that great and was going through injury issues, and legitimately was one of the best guards in the league for a couple of weeks. He had moments against Kobe. He had all kinds of moments in Madison Square Garden. And for him, that resulted in a nice big contract in free agency as well. Houston stepped up, gave him a ton of money, and the Knicks said that they would match it, and then the Rockets changed the contract around and they let him go. Lin was never quite able to recreate the success that he had in New York, but he was still a solid player for years. For the Rockets, bounced around to the Lakers, the Hornets, Nets, Hawks, Raptors, before ultimately leaving for the Chinese Basketball Association on a lucrative contract. And I actually think his career could have lasted longer if he didn't deal with some of these injury issues later on in his career. He's since bounced around overseas and is currently playing professionally in Taiwan. And if you want to talk about basketball sensations, this next guy, Jimmer Fredette, absolutely qualifies. Throughout his career at BYU in college, he was this unbelievable shooter. He wasn't quite what we know Steph is now, obviously professionally, but he was almost like the mini Steph Curry back in college. And just like Steph, he was a high draft pick. He was picked 10th overall in 2011, but for whatever reason, it just never worked for him in the NBA. Some of the shooting stuff did not translate. Obviously, he wasn't as big of a focal point offensively, and in 2014, the Kings cut him from the team. He bounced around to a couple of other teams in the NBA, Chicago, the Pelicans, the Knicks, but in 2016, he actually ends up in the Chinese Basketball Association, just like Jeremy Lin. And you want to talk about becoming a sensation, that is truly what Jimmer Fredette became in China. He had 73 points in a game. He won MVP one year in that league, averaging over 37 points per game. And the style of basketball over there in that league is just out of control with all of the scoring and the fast pace, but it did get the attention of the NBA. He ends up back in the league in 2019 on a 2-year deal with the Suns, but that's also right when COVID hit. So it was obviously difficult for international players to go over to China and play. So he ends up coming back and most recently made the switch to 3-on-3 basketball here in the States. It actually became one of the best players in the world once he switched over to 3-on-3 back in 2022, and he was on the 3-on-3 team for the 2024 Olympics, but unfortunately was hurt early on for Team USA, and they did not even medal, didn't even qualify for the knockout stages, despite being one of the favorites in the event. And that's the most recent news we have for Jimmer Fredette. Next up, let's talk about a legend for all the wrong reasons, Anthony Bennett. Back in 2013, he's picked first overall by Cleveland, and this is a year before LeBron returns to the team in 2014. So this is a big first overall pick selection. Unfortunately for the Cavs, it just wasn't a good draft, and Anthony Bennett ends up being a massive reach in a bad class. Pretty much immediately, it was clear that he just probably wasn't going to be a good NBA player. He had as bad of a start as you could possibly have as a first overall pick in last just 1 year in Cleveland before being traded to the Timberwolves in 2014 as part of a trade for Kevin Love in the offseason in which LeBron returns to Cleveland. Despite some occasional flashes, he also struggled in Minnesota, ends up playing for a couple of other NBA teams throughout his career like Toronto and Brooklyn, but never really made much of an impact. Spent some time in the G League as well, then went and played internationally in Australia, Italy, the Philippines. And as of the recording of this video, he's pursuing a professional basketball career, but is currently not signed to a team. Next up, he was in the thumbnail. You know he's got to be in the video. Let's talk about LiAngelo Ball. Back in the mid-2010s, the Ball family was an internet sensation. They were everywhere. We know that LaMelo made it to the league as a top 3 pick. We know that Lonzo made it to the league as a top 3 pick. Unfortunately, LiAngelo was not able to reach the same heights as his brothers. He went undrafted in the 2018 NBA draft, briefly signed with the Lakers in Summer League 1 year, but didn't make the team. Also played for OKC with their G League affiliate, and there actually was a moment where it seemed like he might make the league when he signed with the Hornets during 2021 Summer League, had some experiences with their organization, but did not make the regular season roster. And it seems like there is scoring talent here, and he's got good size, but just was not able to develop the way that his brothers did as these like lead creating guards. Overall, in his professional basketball career, he's played in the G League, he's played Lithuania, he's played in Australia, but he just was never able to find a full-time spot on an NBA roster. Most recently, he signed with a league in Mexico, and we haven't really gotten any news on him since. Moving on now, let's talk about Michael Carter Williams. After an outstanding season at Syracuse, he went 11th overall to the Sixers in the 2013 NBA draft, and his whole legacy as an NBA player was not only winning the Rookie of the Year award, but immediately looked really good as a player. He's putting up triple doubles against some of the best teams in the league. His overall stats for that season were really good, but I think even Philadelphia realized that he wasn't actually as good as his stats showed. There was just a really bad Sixers team, and Carter Williams was ironically the most talented guy on the team. Not long after winning Rookie of the Year in Philadelphia, they end up moving him to Milwaukee. He bounces around to a couple of other teams as well: Chicago, Charlotte, Orlando, Houston. And whether it be because of injury issues and inability to shoot, just being overrated initially as a rookie, he's just never been able to sustain any kind of NBA success. Most recently, he also signed with the league in Mexico in 2023, but nothing on him since. Moving on now, let's talk about a guy that's actually making YouTube videos about the NBA right now, Roy Hibbert. He was drafted 17th overall by Toronto in the 2008 draft, but was traded to Indiana and became a really impactful defensive player, changed the way that a lot of teams played defensively. For a few years there in Indiana, he was one of the best defensive players in the league. He used his size and verticality to prevent guys from getting to the rim and was a really good postseason player, made multiple all-star teams, and those Pacers teams put up a real fight against Miami in the playoffs for a few years in the mid-2010s. But as high as the highs were for Roy Hibbert, that's about as quickly as things fell off for him as well. Teams realized his inability to move in space. They made sure to attack him in pick and rolls. And just a few years after being a pivotal player on an Eastern Conference Finals team, he was bouncing around all over the place: the Lakers, the Hornets, the Nuggets. And being as big as he was, he ultimately had a lot of injury issues as well, and he retired from professional basketball after the 2016-17 season. And like I said, now he's making YouTube videos, which is pretty cool. Maybe y'all should check out his channel. Moving on now to one of my favorite guys of this era in the NBA, Lance Stephenson. He didn't make too much of an impact initially, but really made his mark with the Indiana Pacers in the early 2010s. Stephenson's whole thing was basically just being a complete maniac. He could defend, he could score, he made some of the flashiest plays you've ever seen, but also would just make some of the craziest plays you've ever seen, not always in a good way. Just like Hibbert, he was a big part of those Pacers teams that were challenging the Miami Heat back in 2013, back in 2014. And that 13-14 season was really his breakout year as well, but he was just never able to sustain that level of play ever again. He was a very, very up and down player, despite a really interesting game that arguably fits better in the league now. Bounced around to a bunch of different teams: the Hornets, Clippers, Memphis, New Orleans, returned to the Pacers in 2017, then went to the Lakers, went to the Hawks, and he is basically the poster child for this video. Guys that might not have had all NBA level impact at any point in their careers, but they certainly were memorable. And most recently, he was actually still trying to make a comeback in the league. He was playing in the G League for the Iowa Wolves and played 3 games with them in the 2023-2024 season. So maybe the Lance Stephenson career isn't quite over yet. Moving on now, let's talk about Andrew Bynum. Back in 2005, he was selected 10th overall by the Lakers straight out of high school. He was the youngest player in the league, and over the next couple of seasons developed into a key critical piece on back-to-back title teams in 2009 and 2010. He was a bruising post player, could guard, could defend the rim, could rebound. But just like some of the other guys in this video, guys like Roy Hibbert, the highs were way up there for Andrew Bynum, and then it just completely fell apart. He's winning back-to-back titles in 09 and 2010. He's second team All-NBA. He's the second best center in the league in 2012, and then his career was basically over. He gets moved in the gigantic Dwight Howard trade. He ends up in Philadelphia. That's that huge trade in 2012 that basically started the process. And he played 0 games in Philadelphia, despite them giving up, Andre Iguodala as part of that trade, as part of a gigantic 14 deal. Played 0 games with them, dealt with injury issues, was just never on the floor for them. Bounced around as well to Cleveland, tried to play for the Pacers, and he retired from professional basketball after the 2013-14 season. So in 2012, he's making second team All-NBA, and 2 years later, he's retired from basketball. He has since attempted multiple comebacks to get back into the league, but it has just never happened for him. It's really unfortunate. Incredibly talented guy, dealt with injury issues, dealt with a couple of other issues as well, and should have had a long, productive career considering how early he came into the league, and it just never happened for him. And that is what happened to some of these true NBA legends.